Let's take a look at the non-aggression axiom in property rights. Now, for those of you who had the micro class, I gave you an article on the non-aggression axiom. And I have to say that the discussion on that subject was very revealing. And so that's why I decided to make this video. So, non-aggression axiom. What's an axiom? Start off with what's an axiom. A self-evident truth that requires no proof. A universally accepted principle or rule. In logic and mathematics, it's usually stated as a proposition that is assumed without proof for the sake of studying the consequences that follow from it. In other words, the bottom line of all of this, it is a statement or a proposition that everyone understands to be true. We don't need any further proof of that statement. So, the non-aggression axiom, as I have normally stated it, and there's some variations in the statement of it, but the non-aggression axiom is, by the mere fact of being a human being, an individual has the right to be free from the initiation of physical force. Now, what does that mean, sort of? Well, if you're a human being, and we all know who and what human beings are, we see them all around us, that by the mere fact that an individual is a human being, they have the right to be free from the initiation of physical force. That means no one can hit them, no one can aggress against them. That physical force also includes the threat of physical force or fraud. Cheating and fraud. In other words, if a mugger walks up to you on the street and says, "Give me all of your money," and he has his hand in his pocket as if he might have a knife or a gun, you hand him your money, and then the question is, did that individual violate the non-aggression axiom? And they clearly violated the non-aggression axiom. You say, well, he did not strike me, he did not hit me, there was no physical force. Well, that's why included under physical force is also the threat of physical force and or also cheating. That means you go into a store and you buy a pound of grapes, and the store weighs your grapes, and you discover that it's only 3/4 of a pound. And if they deliberately did that, now assuming it wasn't a mistake, if they deliberately did that, they have violated the non-aggression axiom. So you can see that the non-aggression axiom can serve as a guide for all the laws that we have, for it's usually referred to as positive law. It can be the very foundation of social interaction. Let's go on and take a look at some of this. And by the way, I have always made this condition. I'm always looking for an exception to the non-aggression axiom. In other words, can you find me an exception to the non-aggression axiom? I've never found anybody that could give me an exception. In other words, they said, I don't believe the non-aggression axiom. If you don't believe the non-aggression axiom, then what is implicit in that rejection of the non-aggression axiom is that you believe that there is an individual or that there is a group of individuals who may initiate physical force against another individual or group of individuals. That's what's implicit there. Now, some people want to say, what if somebody hits me? Then do I have a right to defend myself? And the answer is yes. The statement of the non-aggression axiom is the initiation of physical force. That means you cannot walk up to somebody and hit them. You cannot initiate force against them. You cannot go rob them. That would be initiating physical force. But if somebody hits you, you may use physical force to defend yourself and hit them back if need be. If somebody is robbing your house, you may use physical force to stop that. That would not be the initiation of physical force. That would be you using your own self-defense. Now, a philosophy of property rights and the non-aggression axiom are very, very close to each other. So, why do we want to have a philosophy of property rights? What is property? That's what we're going to look at here. We need to develop a theory of property rights. Why? Why do we need to have that? Well, economics is the study of wealth or property, so we need to have a theory of property rights to be able to really understand and study economics. Now, economics and ethics or political philosophy. Originally, if we go back to the late 1700s and the 1800s, economics was called political economy because it also contained the political area that we look at today as being political science. It contained economics and it contained political science as one. And over the years, economics and political science have diverged or become separate subjects. And property has disappeared from both. So a definition and a theory of property must precede the development of economics. And much has been lost today in deciding what government can do and cannot do is because people have lost sight of what property is and how it came about. Natural law and reason, scientific versus theological, rationally founded natural law. Reason distinguishes man from animals. Man's reason establishes the truth about man. Natural law can act as a guide for positive law. So we're looking at natural law and reason here. We're looking at the scientific versus the theological aspects. We're using rational thought because it is reason that distinguishes man from animal. The philosophical or human ethic question that must be answered. Given that I cannot not act as long as I am alive and awake, and the goods which I must employ in order to act are always scarce, such that there may be an interpersonal conflict regarding their use, then what am I permitted to do right now at this moment? This is the ethical question that we need to answer. And the answer to this question, what am I justified in doing right here and now, basically boils down to this. Every individual owns his own physical body as well as all nature-given goods which he puts to use with his own labor before anyone else does. This ownership implies the right to employ these resources as he sees fit, so long as his use does not change the physical, I emphasize physical here, integrity of someone else's property or reduces their control over it without their consent. Now, here is another statement of the non-aggression axiom in a more natural right form. The right to self-ownership asserts the absolute right of each individual by virtue of his own being, of his being a human being, to own his own body, that is, to control that body free of coercive interference. That's another statement that basically says the same thing, that an individual has a right to live free from initiation of physical force. Why does everyone have the right to be free from aggression and own their own body? Why? Well, there have been three foundations for this axiom. There's been the emotivist, the utilitarian, and the natural rights. And we're going to look pretty much only from the natural rights viewpoint. Now, the proof of the non-aggression or self-ownership axiom. Now, we have said before that you don't need to prove an axiom. And you do not. But here's some more insight. Here's some more insight into why the non-aggression axiom. And if you have any doubts about the non-aggression axiom, this might help you alleviate those. If each individual does not have the right to own his or her own body, then there are only two alternatives. If you don't have the right, there's only two alternatives left over. And now what we're going to do is we're going to show that these other two alternatives violate certain basic principles, one of which is the non-aggression axiom, and therefore they cannot be true. And so if there are only three alternatives and you eliminate two of them as being true, then you must accept the third alternative as being true. So the first alternative, if you do not own your own body, then there's another individual or a certain class of individuals, let's call them A, that have the right to own another individual or class of individuals B. Or two, the second alternative is that everyone has the right to own his or her own equal shares of everybody else. In other words, if you don't own your own body, then everybody else out there, including yourself, own an equal share in your body. So if there's 8 billion people on the face of the earth, then you only own 1/8 billion of you and everybody else owns the rest of you. It's only two ways. If you don't own your own body, that's the only two alternatives. So an individual has the right to own another individual. All right, so that's the first alternative. Another individual has a right to own another individual. That's what you'd be saying if you accepted this alternative. Now, you may emotionally say, this is not right, we know that slavery is wrong, and so forth. But here puts a little more formal proof on that. A would be B's slave and subject to exploitation. So there would be two distinct classes of people would be created. The exploiters A, slaveholders, owners, and exploiters B. We have that around. Exploited A, those are the slaves, and the exploiters B, those are the slave owners, to whom different laws would apply. Now that violates something that's been established in this area of rights and natural rights, is universalization. Now universalization simply says that all laws should be just in that they apply equally to all others. And so this clearly violates the universalization. Also, it basically violates the non-aggression axiom that we have established, in that it allows one group of people to physically aggress against another individual. i.e. slave owners, can physically aggress against the slave. And it also creates a non-human being, which is a contradiction in itself. All right, so we have eliminated the first alternative to you not owning your own body, which is the fact that somebody else owns you. And the second alternative that is that everyone has an equal share in everyone else. Or extended in the words communism, where everybody owns everything. Or, people like to think, or many people like to think that, we've got a public good out here, a park that's equally shared and owned by everybody. Well, I think this hopefully will start start pointing out why there are so many problems with this, quote, joint ownership of things. Now, the universalization test with this alternative is fulfilled. Equal rights would apply to everybody else. Now, individuals need to employ scarce resources to survive. But since all goods are the collective property of everyone else, then no one at any time or place would be able to do anything without the permission of someone else. So, if you are alone in the forest, you have just you've been placed there, and you need to survive, and you see an apple tree, and you know that apples can be nourishment for your body and can help you survive. As you reach to pick that apple, all of a sudden it strikes you that that apple belongs to everybody, and therefore you would need to get permission from everybody to eat that apple. And therefore human beings would not have survived. So we want to throw this everybody owns everything, this collectivist idea, has to go out the window. It violates the non-aggression axiom because it initiates physical force against you, or the threat of physical force against you. The threat there in picking the apple would be that others would claim their right to that apple, and they would use physical force to claim that. So it would be a violation of that. And it's absurd. It would be absurd to have the idea that everybody owns everything, that community property, in other words. Now, hopefully, we have shown that the only thing that's left over out of those three possibilities, you either own your body, or somebody else does, or it's collectively owned, and we've eliminated that somebody else owns it, and it's collectively owned, and therefore the only thing left is you own your body. So, if A assaults B, he is violating the property right of B in his own body. If X takes a watch in the possession of Y, we cannot automatically assume that X is aggressing against Y's right of property. He's not attacking his body, he's attacking a watch that is in the possession of Y. So therefore, since we don't, since we can't say that X has aggressed against the right of Y without having a theory of property rights other than in human beings. So we've got to develop a theory of justice in property to tell us whether X or Y or someone else is the owner of the watch. So how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by taking another example and a similar proof to what we did in proving that we as human beings own our own body. And so we're going to look at this second part, as I call it, our theory of property. And we'll do that sort of fast because we've already gone through the process. So we've established that an individual has self-ownership. For property rights, let's take a look at an example of a sculptor fashioning a work of art. Who owns the work of art as it emerges? The sculptor has transformed nature-given matter into another form dictated by his own ideas and fashioned by his own hands and energy. In other words, his own labor. The sculptor has mixed his labor with clay using the phraseology of the property theorist John Locke. John Locke used the term mixing your labor. And therefore, when you mix your labor with something that is not owned by someone else, that becomes yours. That is one of the ways of distinguishing property. Now, any group of people who expropriated the work of the sculptor would be clearly aggressive and parasitical, benefiting at the expense of the expropriated. If the sculptor has the right to his own product or the transferred materials of nature, then so have the other producers. In other words, the ones who extracted the clay from the ground and then maybe sold it to the sculptor, or the men who produced the tools which the sculptor acquired and used to work the clay. It follows from this that the control of the ground land is the same as that for any other property. So you can see that what we're doing here can be extended to anything else. So, as with the self-ownership, there are three logical alternatives. The sculptor or the creator of the property owns the property. In other words, the sculptor owns the sculpture. The people who produced the clay and sold it owned the clay. The people who produced the tools owned the tools until they exchanged them to the sculptor for whatever it was that they agreed on. So the first alternative is that the sculptor owns the sculpture. The second alternative is that another person, another individual or group of individuals own the property. And they have, in other words, they have the right to take it by force without the sculptor's consent. Or every individual in the world has an equal share in the ownership of the sculpture. In other words, communal solution. We've already seen and gone through how you eliminate those. The number 2 and number 3 violate the non-aggression axiom. Out and out. Number 2 violates the universalization law. In other words, all laws didn't apply to peoples equally. It also separated the society into two groups of which different laws applied. That violated that. And number 2 down there, the community ownership, the sculpture would never be able to produce the sculpture in the first place because they'd have to get permission from everybody in the world to use the clay. The clay producer couldn't produce the clay because he'd have to get permission to be able to dig it out of the ground because the ground belonged to everybody. You see how absurd that is. So we're only left with one answer on who owns the sculpture. It is the creator of the sculpture. It is the sculptor. Who owns the clay? It's the clay producer. Who owns the Chrysler automobiles that are turned off the assembly line? It's Chrysler that owns them. So we have clear definition. Who owns the services of the accountant that hangs out his shingle and produces accounting? The accountant does. So QED, we have proven what was set out to be demonstrated. We have proven that the individual human being owns their own bodies. We have proven that the individual human beings own the output of their labors and effort. We've also given some insight to show you that the non-aggression axiom is true. Needs no, as an axiom, it needs no further proof. It's accepted as being true. You may never have heard it stated as the way it is, but down deep, you know, as a human being, you know that it is true. Now you have another problem. What are the implications of some of this proof? What are the implications of the non-aggression axiom? And I simply want to take a little time to point out some of these to get you to think deeper about this subject and come to terms with it. Because I noticed in the last class, and I've noticed with other students, that sometimes they have real conflict with this idea. You can't be for socialism. What's socialism? Socialism is the collective ownership and or control of the factors of production. I'm a little disappointed that many of you, when you took that introductory course that had my course last session, you didn't really, there was only one or two maybe that really answered that, correctly. You can't be for taxes because taxes are taken by force. I know you're going to have, some of you will have real problems with that because you're going to say, well, how can we exist in society? How can we get along without having taxes? You need to think about it. You need to think about it because I contend for you that the system, the political system we have is immoral because it allows theft. And that might be the reason that when our founding fathers founded our nation, which has been the most free nation in the history of the world, why it has deteriorated, why we can go back and look at any great civilization and see why it fell was because it was based on principles that were immoral, and that soon took over the society and caused it to fall. Can be no welfare payments. There can be no government pensions outside of individual contributions. So you can have no government of any form. So I usually go on into a Robinson Crusoe philosophy there to talk more about these, emphasizing more why they are the ones that are true. But we're going to leave it here with this. And so that has been the non-aggression axiom and its implication for property rights.